Welcome everybody to Hear Me Out Podcast and Frank Analysis. I am your host Franco, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. His name is Jeff Melton. He's a writer of Medium.com, and he also has his own channel called The Bitter Pill. Welcome, Jeff, to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. How about yourself?
Doing well, despite all the craziness that's happening right now. The economic crisis on top of the cultural crisis, on top of the public health crisis and the environmental crisis. So many crises happening at once, but it gives us a lot to talk about. So Jeff, he did a very great job meticulously breaking down the differences between Bernie Sanders's and Tulsi's policies, which created a lot of confusion among a lot of people who call themselves progressives. He has a great article on Medium.com called Bernie Sanders versus Tulsi Gabbard, a comparison, which was published on May 9th. And he also has videos in which he breaks down more specific policies. So, Jeff, why don't you start first with an introduction on, what motivated you to start your channel, and what motivated you to write these articles?
Yeah, well, I've been an activist pretty much my whole adult life. Just to date myself a little bit, I got my start back in the nuclear freeze movement in the 80s, and I was involved in activism in solidarity with folks in Central America who our government was trying to oppress. And I ultimately became a socialist and became sort of recognized through a great book I read, People's History of the United States, all the struggles that people have had over the years just to establish some sort of basic rights, and yet today we remain one of the most oppressive, unequal, just horribly unjust societies on the planet. And
right.
Unlike a lot of my colleagues, I couldn't just kind of bury my nose in the books, so to speak, and ignore it all. I'm a social psychologist by training. I went to grad school for that back in the 80s, and taught psychology for roughly 25 years, and then quit that and became a copy editor a few years back, and also started doing more writing and started my channel. And over the years, I've been involved in just every issue you could imagine. I got involved in animal rights in the 90s and have been ever since. Some of my writings on that. And of course, this pandemic is basically connected to animal agriculture. Most of the diseases that infectious diseases that we have spread from animals to humans, and it's usually because of close contact between livestock and humans. That's what happened with the flu epidemic back in the early 1900s, and it's what happened now. Let's see. My channel and my blog posts. Well, basically, the channel is called The Bitter Pill. I just started it a few months ago. And the reason I came up with the name is that, a lot of people in our society kind of want to turn away from the bitter truths about the world we live in, because it's a big downer. So people kind of avoid getting deeply involved in politics because it's too unpleasant. And the corporate media, of course, try to soothe us and placate us and deflect from these unpleasant truths and focus instead on issues that are not so important, or frame things in a way that's favorable to the political establishment. So we need to try to find those bitter pills that the corporate media hides from us and swallow them.
Yeah.
And so,
And it's
and,
even it's even like within progressives that sometimes they don't even want to swallow the bitter pills. Like they're very comforted,
yeah,
some of them, with believing in Bernie being this like perfect hero for progressives, right?
yeah, sure,
Um, but when you like look at his history, you know, Bernie Sanders is not perfect, and of course his behaviors recently with compensating too much with the establishment, the people he's
yeah,
supposed to be fighting against, because they are bought off by the corporations, and his whole thing is about fighting the corporations. So how are you supposed to get the things done in order to help the working class people if you're going to be working with the people you're supposed to be fighting against?
yeah, yeah. As Jimmy Dore often says, what's the point of getting people elected who don't take corporate money if they wind up, you know, going along to get along with the people who do?
Yeah.
You know,
Um,
at least a lot of the time.
I'm grateful for Bernie, for like opening my eyes to things, like the systemic problems of this country. Because like prior to 2016, I didn't care about politics, but I
Uh,
started caring more when I started understanding better of why we're not seeing many changes. Like we had Obama for 8 years, and I didn't see really much of a difference
yeah,
um, from Bush to Obama.
yeah,
So
definitely.
I do want to get into your article that you wrote, and also all the videos that you did about Bernie and Tulsi's policies. First, let's talk about what Bernie and Tulsi had in common.
Well, they both. I don't think too many people know very much about Tulsi's domestic policies, but they both have in common that they supported single-payer health care and living wage and various other domestic social reforms. And there seems to be this myth among progressives that Tulsi backed away from universal health care, but that's not actually the case. There's lots of different ways of achieving that goal, and hers happened to give a little bit bigger role to private insurance than Bernie's plan did, which maybe it's not ideal, but it still has the government being the dominant payer in the healthcare system, much like Australia. Although her plan is actually better than Australia's. But anyway, all of these countries that are not us and
Yeah.
have the money to do it have very good health care, much better than ours, provided to everyone, regardless of whether they follow the strict single-payer model or they have socialist medicine, socialized medicine like Cuba, or whether they have a program that gives more of a role to private companies. Still, the government's in charge and doesn't let corporations get away with ripping people off.
So Tulsi's policy is single payer, right? Because there's many people criticize her, saying that hers is like a public option, very similar to Pete Buttigieg's Medicare
Right.
plan. So what
Yeah.
is it? It's single payer.
Well, I mean, people throw that term around kind of loosely. So, like
Right.
Canada's system's called single payer, but in reality, dental and eye care are private, and people often have supplemental private insurance. So it's not strictly single payer, but it's close enough because the government is the dominant payer, and so that's the case with both Bernie's and Tulsi's plans. Both allow for some role for private insurance, but the government is the predominant payer.
Okay.
I think I might be missing something that you asked, but
No, I think you answered all of it.
Okay.
So what were the biggest differences between Bernie and Tulsi's policy? You know, from environmental to healthcare to foreign policy, because you had videos dedicated to each one.
Yeah, I wanted to point out the similarities between them on healthcare, and they're also very similar on environmental policy. Tulsi also happens to, unlike Bernie, be a vegan, and as am I, and as such, she understands better than he does what the role of animal agriculture is in environmental problems. And as I said in my article, I wish she would talk about that more, but she does. That's one difference between them on environmental policy. Probably the biggest difference between them is in foreign policy. Bernie has had really kind of a mixed record on foreign policy throughout his time in Congress. He's opposed a few wars and supported a few wars. He supported sanctions against Iraq back in the 90s that killed huge numbers of people. He backed a resolution calling for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and he, of course, did vote against the Iraq war, but supported intervention in Afghanistan and Libya and a number of others. And of course, Tulsi is much younger. She's been in Congress a much shorter time, but during that time, like Bernie, she's not been perfect. She's voted for the military budget a few times, as has Bernie, but the last 4 years, neither of them have voted for it. She's voted for sanctions occasionally against various countries, but she seems to be pretty against that now. And ever since she's been in Congress, she's been a very ardent opponent of U.S. intervention in Syria, and has been among the first politicians, really among the only politicians, to point out that basically the U.S. is supporting terrorists in Syria. That money is, and those weapons are winding up in the hands of Al Qaeda and ISIS and their affiliates there in Syria. And both of them have taken a strong stance, for the most part, in against U.S. interventions in Latin America, such as Venezuela and Bolivia, and so forth. But Bernie has spat a lot of sort of Cold War rhetoric about those bad communists in Venezuela. They're oppressing their people and they're not allowing humanitarian aid and so forth. So he's basically spouting Trump's talking points, while at the same time saying he's opposed to intervention. And Tulsi isn't doing that. And similarly, Bernie has kind of pushed Russiagate, and Tulsi has not. So those are some of the differences. Bernie is much more sort of mainstream in his, I guess you could say, sort of a conventional liberal in terms of his foreign policy.
I want to hear your take on that. Do you think that Bernie Russiagating backfired on him?
Oh, sure. Lots of things he did backfired on him, and that was definitely one of them. Basically, he was told by, I guess, I forget which intelligence agencies, Russia's helping your campaign. And he was like, Russia should stop helping my campaign. So he basically just bought into what they were telling him, and it definitely didn't help him. Because they were going to smear him anyway, no matter what he said. So he didn't really stand to gain anything by playing along so much.
Why do you think Tulsi didn't buy into the Russiagate stuff? Like, for a long time, I was thinking, okay, maybe Bernie's just doing this because, like you say, like your channel is named after, it's too much of a bitter pill for some liberals to swallow, and he wants to attract some of their votes. But Tulsi, she full on did not want to make herself public about even pretending like this is true. She's like, nope, this is not true at all. Russiagate is BS. So why do you think she didn't want to? Pretty much, she was the only candidate, only Democratic candidate that wasn't spewing any Russiagate nonsense.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's very independent-minded, and I think just kind of in keeping with her idea that it is not a good idea to unnecessarily stoke tensions with other countries. Her basic, anti-interventionist approach, it just didn't make sense to try to go after Russia, and so she was able to look at things more objectively than most other politicians and say, well, hey, look, if there's other countries that are having more negative influence on U.S. policy and are more negative actors in the world than Russia, especially the U.S., of course. So, she gave a speech in Congress. I forget what the occasion was, where she just basically said, "Look, let's look at what other countries are doing and not be so obsessed with Russia."
So I do have some young people who are viewers of this channel, and some of which are college students. What were the differences between Bernie and Tulsi's policies on higher education?
I think the main difference was that Tulsi's loan forgiveness was means tested and Bernie's wasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that seems to be the biggest difference between the two, and that's one of the few areas where I disagree with Tulsi and agree with Bernie.
Yeah, that I honestly, that is one of the ones that I agree more with Bernie than on Tulsi.
Yeah.
Especially since I am, a college student.
Oh, okay.
And that is a big deal for me, for
Right.
my living situation. So I also want to bring in Assange, because that's something really important
Right.
To
Yeah.
discuss. So let's talk about those differences between Bernie and Tulsi. Why do you think Bernie never really stood up for Assange? Tulsi, she straight up was not afraid. She right off the bat said she'll support Assange or any whistleblower. Why do you think Bernie didn't?
Well, I guess I'm speculating here, but just go back to when Bernie launched his first campaign in 2015. There was an event that Chris Hedges, who was on his staff, and Sama Stawan, I believe, and some others were there, and Kishama had asked him, why won't you run third party? And he said, because I don't want to wind up like Ralph Nader. Which, of course, Ralph Nader's been ostracized by the establishment, but those of us who understood what he did, not only in his run for president, but in his activism throughout his life, understand what a great accomplishment that is. You give him a lot of credit for it. So I don't think it would be a bad thing to wind up like Ralph Nader. But anyway, my point is that it seems like he's scared of being ostracized, and he wants to kind of fit in with the Democratic Party establishment, even though ostensibly he's an independent when he's not running for president, which I think is kind of a BS claim, because he basically is a Democrat. But yeah, I just think he wants to maybe push for reform and try to popularize some good social reforms, but he doesn't want to rock the boat so much that he's an outcast. And Tulsi isn't too worried about that. Although you could argue that her endorsing Biden when she quit the campaign was a step in the other direction as far as trying to maybe regain some lost ground as far as her standing in the Democratic Party.
So Dak Rulo, who's been a guest on this show, is the one that filmed Bernie Sanders when he asked him the question about Assange.
Yeah.
The vibes that I got from Bernie Sanders there is that he knows that what they did to him is wrong, but he, like you said, and again, this is me speculating too, because like Chris Hedges, the conversation he had with Bernie, it does seem like that was the main driver for him to not stand up for certain things like Russiagate or Assange. What Bernie Sanders doesn't realize is the accomplishment he made in 2016 in raising so many people's consciousness. So the times are different now. Ralph Nader was treated differently back then because less people were consciously aware about the political and systemic problems of our country. But today, there's more people who are awake. There's more people who are communicating, like how me and you are communicating and making all these independent videos. People are more informed now. So I think what could have happened if he was more open about this is he could have gained more support from independents. Maybe some of them would have switched over to be Democrats and supported him in 2016. But we could go on and on about a lot of missed opportunities Bernie had.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, just to directly answer the question about Assange, Tulsi spoke out against Assange's arrest the day it happened, April 11th of last year, and Bernie was completely silent about that until they charged him under the Espionage Act, and he spoke out against that. That was like a month and a half later, and he's never, to this day, mentioned Assange by name in his few attempts to speak up for freedom of the press.
So going back to their policies, Bernie and Tulsi, what was the biggest misconception among both of them, among both of their policies?
By whom?
By Bernie and Tulsi.
What was Bernie and Tulsi's biggest misconception?
Like by progressive media, by supporters, like what was the biggest misconception that they had about their policies?
Well, I mean, I think in Bernie's case, it was, as you were saying, a lot of progressives or liberals or whatever looked upon him as some sort of savior, and were very, very committed to him, to voting for him and campaigning for him, and so forth. And you don't have to be a psychologist like me to recognize that when you're committed to someone or something, you're very reluctant to criticize it. So, I would try to bring up, how not so hot Bernie's foreign policy was with a lot of Bernie supporters, and they didn't want to hear it. And of course, the same thing's true with Tulsi supporters. When, for example, she came out against BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, in solidarity with the Palestinians trying to gain their freedom from Israel, from the Israeli occupation. A lot of people who were her supporters were making excuses for her. And that happens anytime people support someone, I guess, is a human tendency. But in Tulsi's case, I guess the smear campaign against her in the mainstream media was so vicious that, and it was vicious on Bernie too. I talked about the smear campaigns on both of them in the article that you mentioned and some others. But it was worse against Tulsi, maybe even worse than what happened to Ralph Nader. And I think if people hear these sorts of things enough, they come to believe them. So a lot of people were, who consider themselves progressive, were like, she's an Assad toady.
Yes.
She supports Assad in Syria, and she supports fascism in India, and all this stuff. That's there's just no evidence it's true. But people hear something enough, and they come to believe it.
Yeah, not realizing that they are committing the same acts that they hated among Hillary supporters, and what they did in 2016 when they would repeat a lot of mainstream media narratives about Bernie Sanders, which were just smears.
Yeah.
So, what's your take on why their campaigns didn't coalesce in the end? Like when you look at their root goal, Bernie and Tulsi's, they essentially wanted to end this corrupt, corporately financed political system. So what's your take on why the campaigns didn't work together in the end?
I don't know. As far as why I mean, certainly Tulsi would have been willing to work together with Bernie, but I don't think the reverse was the case. There was a lot of infiltration of the Sanders campaign by establishment types, or well, people that I think of as establishment types, even though other people might not, like Ro Khanna and Chuck Rocha and Jeff Weaver and so forth. There also was just this mentality that Bernie's the one who has a chance to win. We're on the train with Bernie, and any other candidate is our enemy. And so, if you take that perspective, you're going to attack all the other candidates. Although, of course, Bernie himself didn't do that enough. He didn't criticize, his good friend Joe Biden or others nearly enough. But some of his surrogates were very nasty toward Tulsi. So as far as that's, I think, a major reason why the campaigns didn't collaborate.
Yeah. And like among those people was like, the people that you mentioned, people who formerly worked for the establishment. There's also the people who were more pro-Warren than they were pro-Tulsi.
Right.
Yeah, I mention this all the time to, all the guests that I have, or whenever I'm on somebody else's show, is that it's such a missed opportunity. Because what the establishment would do is they would bash each other to a certain extent, but in the end, they know that they're still on the same team. But with Bernie, he could have had a team with Tulsi, with Yang, with Marianne Williamson. He probably could have also brought in Inslee. It's just so much coalescence that could have happened there, because there's some people who supported Tulsi that not necessarily were interested in Bernie, but if they see that she's now working with Bernie, they would have joined in. Same thing, the same thing for Yang and Williamson. So it's just really unfortunate. And what do you think we should do going forward into the next election cycle? Because now I see no hope. We're gonna get an establishment candidate no matter what for 2020.
Well, I mean, like you were talking about with the last guest you had on, and I forget her name.
Gloria Jones.
They're going to rig the Democratic primaries no matter what, and they definitely went out of their way just as much this time to do so as they did in 2016 against Bernie, as well as Tulsi this time. And I think the bitter pill we've got to swallow here is that the road to reform isn't going to be through getting a progressive politician elected president. Even if they did, even Bernie Sanders himself acknowledges that by itself wouldn't be anywhere near sufficient to bring about the sorts of changes that he advocates. So we really have to build independent political power. We need to organize a third party that's viable. We need to get out in the streets and do what people are doing right now with these protests. We need to organize both formally and informally labor unions and strikes and so forth. There have been basically unprecedented in the 21st century number of strikes just in the time since people started getting laid off because of COVID. So we have to build on that momentum and use perhaps the working class's most powerful weapon of coordinated withholding of labor.
So what's your stance now on, like, what are you going to do now? Are you going to go for third parties for the general election?
Yeah, I have since 1996 as far as the presidential election. And I live in Indiana anyway, so you know, and it really kind of surprises me that people don't think more about the fact that we have an electoral college, and in only a handful of states does it really matter if you actually believe that the Democrat is a lesser evil, which I'm not so sure is the case with Biden this time. In most states, you're not going to help Biden win anyway, so you might as well try to get the Greens or whoever to 5%, so we can get on the ballot and get matching funds and so forth. But I don't see any point in. I mean, certainly, I think it makes sense to vote for. Excuse me. More progressive candidates who were running on the Democratic Party line sometimes, like what's her name that's running against Deb Wasserman Schultz in Florida. Liking what her name.
Yeah.
And Shahid Buttar running against Pelosi. I could see people voting for him. But in general, as far as voting goes, I think we just, for the most part, have to say no to the corporate Democrats and build power outside the Democratic Party.
So are there any last things you want to mention about differences between Bernie and Tulsi's policy that we didn't mention?
Well, just, we mentioned the Assange issue, and just in general, Tulsi's been a lot more outspoken on civil liberties issues. She introduced a bill to reintroduce the Fairness Doctrine, which basically, when it was in place, you didn't have these networks like Fox and MSNBC and CNN that only promoted one point of view all the time. That wasn't legal. They had to have at least two different sorts of opinions about major issues. And she's fought against censorship and surveillance and so on and so forth. And of course, Bernie's not on the wrong side, generally speaking, but she's been much stronger and more vocal on those issues.
Yeah, I highly recommend to all of you to check out Jeff's videos. He goes into more detail with each, like healthcare, environmental, foreign policy between Bernie and Tulsi. And then that article that he has is also breaks down very meticulously the differences. And also you go into misconceptions too, right? In your article and your videos about their policies. Yeah. Right. So definitely check those out. Subscribe to The Bitter Pill. So now,
and it's not the Bernie and Tulsi show. Those are only some of the things I address.
Right. In the video. But you also are into like animal rights and health.
Yeah.
Which I do want to have you on again to discuss those things, since I'm also a biologist. Thanks for watching that segment of Hear Me Out. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell down below so you can get the latest on sports, pop culture, and progressive politics. Stay informed.